For decades, millions of believers saw Kathryn Kuhlman as a woman uniquely touched by the power of God. They traveled across the country to sit in crowded auditoriums, hoping to witness the miracles that seemed to follow wherever she preached. But behind the public sermons, the packed revival meetings, and the powerful testimonies, there were also private moments that almost no one ever saw. Years after her passing, when people began examining the personal writings she had left behind, they discovered something unexpected. The pages revealed a woman wrestling with doubt, heartbreak, controversy, and a calling that often came at a painful personal cost. What those writings suggested about Kathryn Kuhlman's life was far more complicated than the public image most people remember. The young woman who believed she was called. Long before Kathryn Kuhlman became one of the most recognizable evangelists in America, she was simply a girl growing up in the small town of Concordia, Missouri. Born to Joseph and Emma Kuhlman, she was the third of 4 children in a German-American family that lived a modest life. Her father ran a livery stable and was respected in the town, even serving as mayor. To outsiders, the Kuhlman household appeared stable and ordinary, but Kathryn would later describe her childhood as the place where she first felt something stirring deep inside her spirit. That moment, according to accounts she later shared, came during a revival service she attended as a teenager. The meeting took place in a small church filled with people praying, singing, and listening to visiting preachers who traveled from town to town. During one of those gatherings, Kathryn said she experienced what she called a profound spiritual awakening. The experience changed her sense of purpose almost overnight. While most girls her age were thinking about school, friends, and the future, Kathryn began to believe that God had placed a specific calling on her life. Not long afterward, she made a decision that shocked people around her. Instead of continuing her education, she dropped out of school and began traveling with her older sister Myrtle and Myrtle's husband, Everett Parrott. Everett was an evangelist who had studied at Moody Bible Institute, and he spent much of his time preaching across the western United States. Kathryn initially joined them only temporarily, but the experience quickly transformed into something far more permanent. Traveling ministry in those years was not glamorous. Kathryn and the Parrotts often stayed in basic lodging and moved constantly from town to town. Their meetings were sometimes held in churches, but just as often they took place in rented halls, small community buildings, or wherever people were willing to gather. Yet something about the young woman speaking beside Everett began to capture attention. Witnesses recalled that when Kathryn spoke, she did not sound like a timid teenager. Instead, she spoke with a conviction that surprised many people listening to her. By the time she was in her early 20s, Kathryn made a bold decision. She would start her own ministry. In Boise, Idaho, she delivered one of her earliest independent sermons in a rundown pool hall. It was hardly the setting people would associate with a future national figure, but for Kathryn, it represented the beginning of something much bigger. The scandal that nearly destroyed her ministry. As Kathryn Kuhlman's reputation grew in the western United States, so did the expectations placed upon her. By the time she settled in Denver and established what became known as the Denver Revival Tabernacle, she was no longer simply a young preacher traveling from town to town. She had become the center of a growing ministry that attracted hundreds of people each week. Radio broadcasts began carrying her sermons into homes across the region, and listeners who had never seen her in person began writing letters describing how her message had affected their lives. To many supporters, Kathryn seemed unstoppable. But behind the scenes, her personal life was about to create a crisis that would threaten everything she had built. The turning point came after the sudden death of her father. Those who knew Kathryn later said the loss deeply shook her. During that emotional period, a visiting evangelist named Burroughs Waltrip arrived at the Denver Revival Tabernacle. Waltrip was a charismatic traveling preacher from Texas who quickly made an impression on the congregation. Tall, confident, and persuasive, he had a style of preaching that complemented Kathryn's emotional intensity. The two began working together during services, and before long their professional relationship developed into something far more personal. There was only one problem. Waltrip was already married and had children. When their relationship became public, it sent shockwaves through the church community surrounding Kathryn's ministry. Supporters who had admired her dedication to spiritual life suddenly began questioning her judgment. Critics accused her of betraying the moral standards she preached from the pulpit. Even some of her closest friends warned her that continuing the relationship would destroy her reputation. But Kathryn struggled to interpret what she believed was God's will in the situation. According to later accounts, she convinced herself that Waltrip's marriage had already collapsed and that their relationship was somehow justified. Eventually, Waltrip divorced his wife, and Kathryn married him. Instead of calming the controversy, the marriage intensified it. Many followers who had once filled the pews of the Denver Revival Tabernacle stopped attending. Donations dropped, criticism grew louder, and religious leaders who had previously supported Kathryn began distancing themselves from her ministry. For the first time in her career, the future that had once seemed so clear now looked uncertain. The miracles that made her famous when Kathryn Kuhlman arrived in Franklin, Pennsylvania, she was no longer the confident rising evangelist people had once admired in Denver. The scandal surrounding her failed marriage had damaged her reputation, and many believed her ministry was finished. Yet Franklin became the place where her life and career began an unexpected transformation. Instead of trying to rebuild quickly or reclaim the fame she once had, Kathryn started quietly preaching at a local church known as the Franklin Gospel Tabernacle. What happened there would change the direction of her ministry forever. At first, the meetings were relatively small. Kathryn preached simple sermons about faith, forgiveness, and surrendering one's life to God. Unlike some revival preachers who focused on dramatic performances, her style was calm and emotional at the same time. She spoke slowly, often pausing in the middle of a message as if she were listening for something beyond the room. Some listeners later said those moments were when the atmosphere inside the church seemed to change. People began coming forward during the services asking for prayer, not just for spiritual guidance, but for physical healing. The first reports of unusual healings came almost quietly. Someone claimed that a long-standing pain had disappeared after prayer. Another person testified that a medical condition had suddenly improved. At first, these stories circulated only among the congregation, but as the weeks passed, the number of testimonies began to grow. Soon, people from surrounding towns started arriving to see what was happening inside the small Franklin church. Kathryn never claimed that she possessed supernatural powers. In fact, she repeatedly insisted that she was not a faith healer. According to her own explanation, healing was the work of the Holy Spirit, not the result of any human ability. Her role, she said, was simply to recognize when God was moving among the people in the room. Yet the more she repeated that message, the more the crowds grew. People traveled long distances hoping to witness or experience something extraordinary. Within a few years, the Franklin services became too large for the small church building. Kathryn moved many of the meetings to larger auditoriums, eventually establishing regular gatherings in Pittsburgh. These events soon became known as her famous miracle services. Week after week, thousands of people packed into the halls where she preached. Some came with wheelchairs, crutches, or medical records, hoping to leave without them. Others simply came to watch. The growing attention also attracted journalists. Reporters from newspapers and magazines began attending the services, writing stories that ranged from supportive to deeply skeptical. Some publications described emotional scenes of people weeping with joy after claiming they had been healed. Others questioned whether the improvements people reported could be explained by medical science or psychological factors. One physician, William Nolan, later conducted a study examining several people who said they had been cured during Kuhlman's meetings and concluded that none of the cases he investigated represented genuine miracles. Despite criticism, Kathryn's influence continued expanding. Radio broadcasts carried recordings of her services across multiple states, allowing listeners who had never attended in person to hear testimonies from those who believed they had experienced healing. The combination of radio exposure and word-of-mouth reports turned her into a national figure. By the time the charismatic movement began spreading through churches in the following decade, Kathryn Kuhlman had become one of its most recognizable voices. Her meetings were no longer limited to Pennsylvania. She began traveling between Pittsburgh and Los Angeles, speaking in large auditoriums and conducting services that often filled every available seat. Some people attended out of deep faith, others out of curiosity, and still others hoping for relief from illnesses that doctors had been unable to treat. Fame, wealth, and the questions that followed. As Kathryn Kuhlman's reputation spread across the United States, her ministry entered a period of extraordinary growth. By the time the charismatic movement began influencing churches across the country, she was no longer simply a revival preacher holding meetings in regional auditoriums. She had become a national religious figure. Thousands of people filled the halls where she spoke, and her influence expanded even further through radio and television. What had once been a small ministry in Pennsylvania now reached millions of listeners and viewers who followed her broadcasts each week. One of the most important developments during this period was her television program, I Believe in Miracles. The show introduced a format that had rarely been seen before in Christian broadcasting. Instead of delivering only sermons, Kathryn invited people who claimed to have experienced healing to share their stories directly with the audience. These testimonies often described dramatic recoveries from illnesses that doctors had struggled to treat. The program aired nationally and quickly attracted a loyal audience. Over the years, hundreds of episodes were recorded, each one reinforcing the image of Kathryn Kuhlman as a minister closely connected to extraordinary events. The success of the broadcasts also brought financial growth. Donations from supporters increased dramatically as her popularity expanded. To manage the growing flow of contributions, the Kathryn Kuhlman Foundation was established. The organization funded mission projects around the world and supported various Christian initiatives, including educational institutions and rehabilitation programs. According to reports from the period, millions of dollars passed through the foundation during the height of her ministry. To many supporters, these funds represented proof that her influence was helping people far beyond the revival meetings she conducted in person. Yet as her fame grew, so did the scrutiny surrounding her work. Journalists and critics began examining not only the claims of healing, but also the way the ministry operated behind the scenes. Some observers questioned whether the dramatic testimonies presented during meetings and television programs could be verified medically. Others focused on the financial side of the organization, asking how donations were handled and how resources were distributed through the foundation. The pressure increased when a legal dispute emerged involving one of her employees. A personal administrator who had worked closely with her filed a lawsuit claiming that he had not been properly compensated for his work. The complaint also included accusations involving valuable items that were allegedly being kept privately rather than recorded within the organization's accounts. Kathryn denied the allegations and insisted that the records involved were not confidential in the way the lawsuit suggested. Eventually, the dispute was settled before reaching a full trial, but the controversy attracted national attention and placed her ministry under intense public examination. Major newspapers and magazines began covering the story, and reporters revisited earlier debates about the authenticity of the healings reported in her meetings. Some articles described devoted followers who believed they had witnessed genuine miracles. Others highlighted critics who argued that emotional environments and the power of suggestion might explain many of the experiences people described. For Kathryn, the situation created a complicated reality. On one hand, she continued preaching to packed auditoriums filled with people who believed deeply in her message. On the other, her name increasingly appeared in headlines connected to skepticism and controversy. Despite the growing pressure, she rarely changed her public message. She continued insisting that healing was not the central focus of her ministry. In interviews, she explained that the real purpose of her work was spiritual transformation rather than physical recovery. Yet the extraordinary stories surrounding her meetings made it nearly impossible to separate the two in the public imagination. The private struggles few people knew about. By the time Kathryn Kuhlman reached the final years of her ministry, the world knew her as a powerful evangelist who could fill enormous auditoriums and reach millions through radio and television. Crowds continued to attend her miracle services in cities such as Pittsburgh and Los Angeles, hoping to witness the same extraordinary moments that had been reported for decades. From the outside, her life appeared to be a remarkable success story. Yet the reality behind the public ministry was far more complicated than most people realized. Those who worked closely with her often described Kathryn as a deeply private person. Even while standing before thousands of people during her meetings, she guarded much of her personal life carefully. She rarely spoke about her own physical health, and she avoided discussing the emotional toll that years of constant travel and public scrutiny had taken on her. Instead, she continued focusing on the message she believed she had been called to deliver. During the last phase of her life, however, the pressures surrounding her ministry grew heavier. The legal disputes, media criticism, and continuing debate over the healings associated with her services created constant stress. At the same time, she was quietly facing health problems that she shared with very few people. Doctors eventually diagnosed her with a heart condition, something that shocked many followers who had always seen her as a symbol of strength. After experiencing complications related to her heart, she traveled to Tulsa for surgery. The procedure was intended to correct the problem and allow her to return to her ministry. Instead, the operation marked the final chapter of her life. Kathryn Kuhlman passed away during the surgery, bringing an abrupt end to a career that had influenced millions. Her funeral took place at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale, where evangelist Oral Roberts delivered the sermon. In the years since her death, the debates surrounding her ministry have never fully disappeared. Some people remember her as a woman through whom miracles occurred, while others remain skeptical about the extraordinary claims connected to her meetings. What do you think? Was Kathryn Kuhlman truly witnessing miracles, or was there another explanation behind the stories people told? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories uncovering the hidden lives behind famous figures.